And we are so happy to have with us Timothy DenHerder-Thomas, who is the co-founder and general manager of Cooperative Energy Futures. That's an energy efficiency and community-owned clean energy cooperative that serves members across Minnesota since 2009. Timothy has also worked with the Minneapolis Clean Energy Partnership as a member of the Partnership's Energy Vision Advisory Committee and supports energy democracy nationally through the People's Solar Energy Fund and PowerShift Network. He's going to give the main presentation today, but before we go to the Q&A, he will be followed by Elizabeth Dickinson, who is a writer, community activist and organizer, and board member with Community Power Minnesota. And she is a local activist. I could say more. I think she's been a member of the Green Party, whatnot, and very active in St. Paul. And she'll be letting us know what specifically, I believe, MN 350 in St. Paul is doing. And then we will go into some Q&A. But let me turn it over to Timothy. But let me remind everybody, keep yourselves muted at this point, and probably most of you have already X'd out your video as well, but I'll be doing that too. And so if everybody else wants to put up the video so we can accept Timothy and probably Elizabeth, let's keep them prominent. Okay, welcome, Timothy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so you can all see some slides. Do you have my intro slide pulled up there?
I see it.
Okay, great. Again, thank you all for having me to talk to you today. This is definitely a different format, and times and situations are changing, and appreciate you engaging as we are here. As Audrey mentioned, I help run a clean energy cooperative based in Minneapolis, but working with a number of communities across the Twin Cities. And I wanted to really start off by talking a little bit about what is the key barrier to community-owned energy, to an energy future that really centers and serves everyone. And I'm gonna share a lot of examples from our work as a co-op, but really highlighting that is a local aspect of a national movement that is growing to develop energy solutions in a way that advances democracy, in a way that advances community control. So just to highlight the problem, I mean, I think everyone on this call is familiar with the concerns around climate change, concerns around fossil fuels and the pollution that it creates. But time and time again, as we've been talking with communities across Minnesota, as other groups that we've been working with across the country have been talking with their communities, the vast majority of households right now can't participate in the standard way to develop clean energy, which historically has been you build a clean energy system, primarily a solar array, on your roof. Whenever I go to a community event and ask people if you could install solar energy that would provide the power that you needed affordably and in a way that would serve your energy needs, who would want to do it? Just about every hand in the room goes up. And then I ask, well, put your hand down if you're a renter and you don't own property, so you're not allowed to do that. And a bunch of hands go down. And put your hand down if you have a bunch of trees or another building, or your roof faces east or west, or for some other reason you can't physically put solar on your roof. And some more hands go down. And then you ask the question, well, who here has $15,000 to $25,000 to put solar on your home? Or wants to take out a loan and has the credit and ability to access a loan to do that. And usually by the end of that conversation, we're actually down closer to 5 or 10% of the people in the room still have their hands raised. And I wanted to just take a moment to highlight what that means if the way that we approach climate solutions, if the way that we approach the transition to clean energy is all about individual personal action. If that's the way we go about it, it means that the people who are going to participate in this future are going to be property owners with income and access to wealth, and really who aren't struggling financially. Whereas if we look at who is most impacted by a fossil energy economy, by climate change, it is It is folks who are lowest income, both locally and globally, who have the least resources to protect themselves, who are often in the communities most immediately impacted by pollution, and also are struggling the most with energy costs. Right now in Minnesota, the average household is only spending about 3% of their income on energy. But if you take low income households on average, that number goes up to about 7%. And there are a large number of households in Minnesota that are spending upwards of 10%, sometimes as even as high as 20 or 30% of their income paying for utility bills. And they're not generally the folks who uh, own a home with solar access and have a bunch of capital to put clean energy up themselves. So I really wanted to highlight that, aside from even just the justice elements of making sure that we're developing clean energy in a way that is accessible, if we really care about addressing climate change, addressing the environmental catastrophe and all of its impacts, it's not going to work unless we develop a solution that works for everyone. I secondly wanted to highlight that, yes, we have various state laws that are requiring energy utilities to transition to clean energy. And there's been quite a lot of success with that. We're actually, as a state, already at over 20% renewable energy, primarily wind, mostly because of state regulations that require the utilities to invest in those technologies. The challenge is that's not fast enough. We are not making this transition quickly enough. And it's sort of a situation where every time we want to make an advance, we have to have a big state policy fight to force the utilities to do something else. Because, while yes, the technology is getting cheaper and more cost effective, there are all of these existing investments that energy utilities have in large power plants, in centralized power lines and other pipelines and distribution infrastructure that those utilities are counting on making money on for the next several decades. And if we are putting all of our cards in the hands of the entities that have billions of dollars invested in continuing to operate fossil fuel energy systems, we're not likely to get where we need to go. I wanted to highlight also that the approaches that utilities have tended to take are large, very centralized energy systems that are not necessarily the best fit for the energy plants. For example, if you build, a huge solar farm in one location, what happens when a cloud passes over that one specific area, or it stops being windy at that one specific area? All of a sudden you have a huge downturn in how much energy is being produced. And if that's how we're developing renewable energy, then the traditional answer is, well, we have to build that time when the energy is not being produced. So that creates the demand for a whole bunch of new natural gas plants, which are fueling fracking all over the country, and also locking in costs for ratepayers over time as the cost of natural gas goes up. Whereas if we take more of a community-centered approach and we distributed our renewable energy, many different locations, many different technologies, that curve of when clean energy is produced tends to level out much more substantially. And there's been research around the country that there are ways to develop clean energy systems even before we get to storage that can meet 80, 90, even 95% of energy needs before we start looking at things like storage and other similar technology. I wanted to highlight this really as some context for why community solar here in Minnesota, but in general, models that allow whole communities to participate in clean energy together are such a key piece of the transition. Piece of how we have moved forward as a cooperative is really noticing after we've tried to get households to implement solar one-on-one and realizing that only a very small portion of people can actually do that, that we need a different model. And one model that's been put in place here in Minnesota is a community solar garden, which, as many of you probably know, is a way to participate in clean energy and cut your energy costs. So there's actually no need for a net investment, and you also don't have to own property. This is a sector in Minnesota that is expanding really rapidly based on community interest. And I want to emphasize the could here. There is the potential here to make clean energy accessible to all. We haven't seen that to be the only thing or even the dominant thing that's happening in the industry. And I want to talk about what that means and why kind of this next question of justice and democracy, I think, is so important. But just as a really brief overview, again, I know many of you are probably familiar with community solar, but just as some background, in a community solar garden, there's a developer, also called a facilities manager, that builds a solar array. This can be on a large commercial building, it could be in an open field, and finances this. The electricity is delivered to the utility here in Minnesota. It's Xcel Energy that is required to run this program. The utility then has to give credits on the utility bill to community members who participate. So you're effectively, as a community subscriber, you are being paid for the energy that is produced by your portion of the array. And then community subscribers are making payments back to the facility manager, in our case, a clean energy cooperative energy futures, which helps cover the cost of financing and operating the solar project. So again, here the community members don't have to put solar on their individual property. They don't have to own property. They can be a renter. They can move around within a community and still participate. And they get credit on their utility bill. In nearly all cases, credit that is higher than the amount they owe as a subscription payment for being a part of the project. That's generally how community solar works. I did want to emphasize that how the profits and decision making work among these types of projects are very different based on who the developer is. And while I've put community subscribers here who are individuals, that's not necessarily the norm of what's going on in Minnesota. I wanted to just take a moment to highlight how significant this has been. This is a chart of how much solar has been installed per year in Minnesota in 3 different categories. So this tiny little gray, like dark gray category at the very bottom of this chart that says distributed, that is all of the solar that is being installed on all of the individual households, as well as all of the businesses that are putting solar on their buildings to directly serve the meter at their property. And for a long time, this was really the only way that we did solar in Minnesota. Until about 2015, that's all there was. As of the beginning of 2016, we had about 37 megawatts of solar installed in the entirety of the state, meaning from the mid 60s up until 2015. In that entire time period, Minnesota had installed 37 megawatts of solar. You can see the annual numbers in 2013 and 14 and 15. Since then, Minnesota has installed nearly 1,000 megawatts of solar, meaning in the past 3 years, 4 years, we have installed roughly 25 times as much solar as in the entire previous 45 years combined. And really what has caused this shift is 2 sectors. One is, as you can see, the light gray, utility scale solar. These are large solar farms that energy utilities build and own. But then there's this other category, which is community solar. And if you look at 2018 in this chart in particular, you can see that while there has been this big pulse of utility solar, the utilities primarily are doing that when they're ordered to buy projects. And when there isn't a state regulation saying this is the best way to provide your power, that demand kind of dries up. And it's really the community scale projects that are causing solar energy to expand so rapidly in Minnesota. So, I did also want to highlight here, now when we say community, what does that actually mean? There are a large number of developers, and especially early on in the first 4 years or so of community solar development, there was a large number of out-of-state developers who came in to develop community solar gardens in Minnesota, primarily to serve commercial and industrial customers. So right now, almost 90%, I think the latest numbers are 87, 88% of all of the capacity of community solar gardens in Minnesota are subscribed to non-residential customers. So this includes major corporations, it includes municipalities, it includes school districts. There's a lot of these larger subscribers in these projects. And, I really want to emphasize it's great for all of those sorts of entities to have access to clean energy as well. The fact that so little of the development has focused on really creating access to um, local energy users, I think is a big problem. And it's particularly a big problem because um, other than a few specific project examples and the work that we do as Cooperative Energy Futures, in the remaining 10% that is serving residential, pretty much all of the developers are using a credit score requirement to say who can be a part of the project. And it's pretty typical to have a credit score requirement of either 680 or 700, which means that somewhere between 40 and 45% of Minnesotans are not even eligible. And that tends to be low income households, communities of color, various other communities that have faced historic economic and racial marginalization in our society who are being shut out of that opportunity. So, what we've seen here in Minnesota is this opening up of the utility sector. So, it's not just the utilities who can develop these larger scale solar projects, has caused a dramatic increase and really a surge in how we're developing solar as a state. But it hasn't been happening in a particularly equitable way. It hasn't been happening in a way that is really meeting the needs of the people who have the highest energy burdens, who are the most impacted by pollution, and really who I think have the most at stake and the most to gain from a just transition to climate solutions, from an approach to climate solutions that is really putting the most marginalized in our communities at the forefront and receiving the vast majority and the initial wave of the benefits of the green economy. I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about what we do as Cooperative Energy Futures, and this is really intended to serve as kind of a case study or a role model or an example of what it looks like to build a different type of clean energy development in the state. We're a member-owned co-op. This is our annual meeting last year. We hosted it at Pax Christi Catholic Church in Eden Prairie, because that is actually the site of one of our solar gardens. And so we did tours of the project for a bunch of subscribers. We have right now just over 860 members across the state. So these are people living in communities, urban, suburban, rural, who have voluntarily decided that they want to be part of this organization. And they all elect and have the chance to run for the board of directors. And also, as the cooperative earns profit from all of the development work that we do, that's distributed among our members. So we see this as huge, both in terms of putting democracy back into how energy development is done, and also ensuring that the wealth that's generated from clean energy is returning to the communities that use the energy. We also really focus on doing project development in a way that is community centered. So this was a launch event hosted on the roof of Shiloh Temple International Ministries in North Minneapolis. The speaker there is Bishop Howell, who is the pastor at the church, and standing next to him is an imam at the neighboring mosque, Masjid An-Nur, which is also one of the backup subscribers on this project. And also standing in this picture are community subscribers, some of the workers system, and some local elected officials who have been helping to move clean energy forward. So we really believe that the way we should be doing clean energy development is to center and highlight community vision, community stories, community solutions, and to bring people together around envisioning and guiding how our projects look. This is part of the workforce team that did the installation of our Shiloh Temple project and also went on to do installations of several of our other projects. We partnered with a job training program held in North Minneapolis out of Emerge, and several of the folks who went through that program are residents of North Minneapolis. One of the things I will just mention, one of these guys, Keith Dent, uh, is also a subscriber on this project, so also getting the benefit of the energy from the Shiloh Temple system. And then about a year later, ran for our board of directors and is currently one of our board members. So we have a very strong focus on seeing how we can make sure that um, it's not just people in the community being served, but also the like authorship, visioning, and decision making structure moving into how our projects are run. Um, there's also been a lot of discussions now in terms of how is the solar industry as a whole in Minnesota really not very equitable, and a lot of conversations with some of the workers of color that we've helped take a step into this industry about how to create more autonomy for workers of color in the industry, where there is historically a lot of marginalization, kind of like a last in, first out as the industry goes up and down, and how to create more control for workers in that work. Just wanted to share some pictures of what these projects look like. This is a community solar garden. This is the Shiloh Temple project in North Minneapolis. That's downtown in the background, Broadway Avenue in the foreground. This is a relatively small project. It's actually much smaller than most of the projects we are doing now, serving part of the needs of the church, the nearby mosque, and 27 neighborhood residents in Northside. We do try and connect people to kind of thinking about and understanding how does energy production work. This is just a still from a real-time energy readout that we have, so where people can kind of see and understand, oh, based on the weather, here's how much energy we produced this day. And you can kind of see it going up and down based on the weather, and helping people think about, well, this is where my energy production is happening now. Where was it coming from before? And that opens up all of these opportunities to talk about how we're getting power right now from coal plants and natural gas plants and nuclear plants that are hurting the health and stability of communities very nearby and all around the world. And so it's really about helping people connect to that relationship as well with their energy. Just wanted to briefly zoom out. Since that first project in North Minneapolis, we've done a set of 8 projects, 4 of them in the core cities on rooftops and on a parking garage, and 4 of them in greater Minnesota, working more with rural communities. This was a launch project for our system in Edina, which again was a partnership with the city serving explicitly Edina residents. So, obviously the equity considerations there are not quite the same as in many other communities, but really focusing on ensuring that it's contributing to the workforce justice piece of it, as well as providing an example of how a local government can kind of initiate, here's how we do solar in a way that is really serving people in our community. And that has since become a role model that other cities are looking to replicate. This is one of our rural projects. This is near St. Cloud. This is a really exciting project because it was bringing together subscribers from the Somali and Latino communities in St. Cloud, which is a area where there's been a lot of racial tensions and racism against new immigrant communities for a long time. But there's also a very strong and growing immigrant community in that area, and providing an opportunity for that community to be part of clean energy. Subscribers to this project, some are also from a manufactured housing park in Fridley. That is a manufactured housing park co-op. So manufactured housing is one of the places with the least stability and resident control in most areas. And an organization called the North Country Cooperative Foundation has been helping residents of manufactured housing co-ops of manufactured housing parks form co-ops and buy out the land under their homes so that they can create housing stability. And we partnered together with them and a number of the local residents to then invite members of those housing co-ops to join in this clean energy co-op so that they're creating a similar economic stability around their supply of energy, which after housing is, for most households, the largest single cost of maintaining your household. This project also has residents from several of the communities along the I-94 corridor, including Monticello, which is the host site for one of Excel's major nuclear plants, and Becker, which is the host site for Excel's largest coal plant. So there were a lot of interesting conversations around bringing together rural and small town Minnesotans around the transition in our energy system as well, from dirty energy to clean energy. This is a project that's actually just about to go online just outside of Faribault, Minnesota. And again, similarly, a really interesting partnership between rural, mostly white community members who are farmers or other rural residents of the area, many subscribers from a large Somali community in Faribault, as well as residents of a manufactured housing park in Cannon Falls nearby, all participating in this cooperative solar project. This was one of our most exciting and by far the most challenging projects to date. This is Ramp A in downtown Minneapolis. So that's Target Field right in the background. You can see the Herc trash burner right in the back as well. This is a canopy over the parking garage developed in partnership with Minnesota Department of Transportation, with the ramp is also operated by the city of Minneapolis. And so this was a really exciting opportunity to do a very high profile project that many people in the community can see. And on large projects like this, in the last tour that I showed you, we have in each case between 150 and 190 community residents offsetting their full energy cost for the next 25 years from these projects. Again, the vast majority of our subscribers don't pay anything upfront to subscribe, so it's very accessible for renters and other members of the community to be a part of it and get an immediate reduction in utility bills without having to invest on the front end, which again is not possible for many people. This is a community celebration that we had for the Ramp A project with a number of different community members and some of the construction and public management stakeholders that helped launch this project as well. Again, you can see kind of this is right in the city. It's a very central location, and I think is really helping raise the profile of these sites, this sort of work. I did want to just briefly kind of help explain how this works, because I think often we talk about these projects in a way that it's it's really exciting to I think look at what does it look like to develop solar in a way that is benefiting people broadly. But there's a lot of moving parts that I think the real work is as a co-op and as a movement, as grassroots groups and people across the state and across the country and the world. How do we help communities step into the role of decision making and creation? Because so often that has been in somebody else's hands and not really having an avenue for people, particularly low income people and people of color, to understand, decide how I want to plug into and make decisions about how that relationship works. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Again, there'll be a recording, but I just wanted to give you a sense of all the moving parts. So usually solar development starts, and this is not just how we do it, this is how solar development in general starts. It starts with a developer who's kind of pulling together all the pieces. They coordinate with the utility to connect to the grid, to a host site to set up a lease and decide where the solar is going to be located, to the various permitting agencies to get permits, and to what's called an engineering, procurement, and construction contractor, or EPC, who's designing and actually installing the system. Then there's this whole side about the financing. And this is a whole world that right now is set up in ways that are very skewed towards Wall Street and large scale capital, and figuring out how to do it in a way that really benefits communities has been a huge part of the work. So traditionally you have a lender who's providing a debt, often a bank, a tax equity investor, often a corporation or private equity firm, that has all of the tax credits or can use all of the tax credits because they have enough taxable income. This is one of the huge injustices around energy development that's built into the federal tax code, is that, again, on these community size systems, you have several $100,000 in tax credits. But you can only apply that to passive income or certain types of commercial real estate income, which is not something that ordinary people tend to have. So you're kind of forced to find large investor partners to use that, which then, of course, means that they get to, in many cases, dictate a lot of the terms. And then you have a sponsor entity, which is kind of the long-term owner and operator. Again, many other developers, this is a private for-profit company, sometimes not even local or in the state. In our cases, that's a community energy co-op. Then you have the process of engaging people. Again, we've had a number of instances across the state where, again, in majority, it's just commercial and industrial subscribers. Members of the community are not being engaged. Or when members of the community are being engaged, there's been a number of issues and complaints with, people going door to door, not letting people really review contracts, people being sold something that they don't have a lot of flexibility on exit or don't really understand what they're being pushed into. There's a lot of issues with how this has rolled out with some of the developers that are serving residential. And then, of course, all the details of actually how it's built. All of the places where you get equipment, you subcontract for various labor and technical experience, and then obviously the workers. And there's been a lot of injustices in that as well. And I could take a long time, which I won't right now, talking about kind of how all the rules are set up around workforce and labor in the solar industry. And then you have the long-term operation. How do you manage and maintain subscribers over 25 years that these projects operate? How do you ensure that systems are maintained and operating well? So this is a little bit of a map of what it takes to get a project put together. And then I want to talk just briefly about what does it look like or what does it mean once it's actually being operated. So first, to finance it, those three parties, the lender, the tax equity investor, the sponsor, are putting capital into a project. Again, just to give you a sense of scale, the 8 projects we've developed so far, the total capital cost is about $16 million. We ended up being able to structure that so that only about 10% of that had to come through our co-op and actually from community members and other sources of capital we could acquire. And I think figuring out how we enable communities to leverage investment so that communities really have ownership is a key piece of this. Then money goes out to pay for the connection, the interconnection to the utility, whoever's doing the development, whoever's recruiting subscribers, and then the majority of it is to actually install the system. And then the EPC, that contractor, is then paying their subsidiary suppliers, subcontractors, and workers. Now we have a system that is operating, it's in service. The project itself is delivering energy to the utility. So the utility is getting the kilowatt hours directly. The utility is then paying subscribers on their utility bill. So actually every single month, the subscriber sees a negative credit or a negative amount on their utility bill that in many cases will actually take their utility bill down to zero. The subscriber is then paying a subscription fee, usually a portion of that savings, to the owner to operate the system, which then goes to pay for subscription management and operation and maintenance. And then whatever is left goes to pay off lenders and provide a return to both the tax equity investor and the sponsor. I do want to emphasize here again, many of the development companies are ultimately selling these projects to large private equity firms. I think somewhere around 50% of the community solar in Minnesota through various subsidiaries ultimately traces back to ownership by Berkshire Hathaway. So the solar industry in Minnesota right now is still highly centralized from an investment perspective, with a lot of the wealth going to outside investors. And the work that we've done as a co-op and that other co-ops around the country are starting to do as well is really taking sort of a different layer of looking at the equity of this whole system. Just to make it clear, these are the roles that our co-op plays directly and that several of the other partner co-ops that we're familiar with around the country are playing. I just wanted to briefly highlight one in particular, Co-op Power, that works out of Massachusetts and New York and is doing very much a similar approach for low-income residents in those states. There are a handful of others around the country that are doing this more community-centered approach to community solar with local ownership and a focus on low-income access and workforce. But it really is a pretty new industry and a pretty new way of looking at renewable energy development. There's been people thinking about and talking about this for a long time, but it has been very hard to scale for many communities. I did also want to just mention there is, of course, the addition that we mentioned of the training programs, because of all of the needs for equity, given that we are in a state where the racial disparity in employment is so high, and that all around the country, racial disparities in the renewable energy sector are very high. I also wanted to mention that, after that whole distribution, we do also have the redistribution of profits to our subscribers, and that is a unique piece of being a co-op. I'm going to skim through this. I know I'm getting close to time, but I want to just emphasize here that in this approach, the places that are hosting solar are not paying to have solar installed on their site. The farmers who host this aren't paying. The commercial buildings that host this aren't paying. It's not really a solar energy system that is powering them explicitly. It is powering the community. And so as a co-op representing those community members, the co-op is financing the system and paying a lease fee. Most of our subscribers are paying month by month with a net savings. So again, you don't have to pay anything on the front end. Let's say in a given month, you save $100 on your utility bill. You'll pay $90 to the co-op, as a rough example. So there's an immediate net savings to being part of clean energy. Some of our subscribers do decide to subscribe up front. They want to pay on the front end to get more savings over time. This is more like installing solar on your own house. And those subscribers who tend to be, middle and upper income households, that is part of what provides the capital that the co-op can use to create access to everyone else as well. I mentioned the membership, democratic stake, profit sharing. We partner with tax investors and sources of project debt. I did want to emphasize that we have been very successful in finding commitments to project capital that are really beneficial to the community. So the vast majority of the cash is going back to the co-op and to the community members from the beginning. And actually after 6 to 10 years, depending on the project, the co-op has full ownership of these projects. So it's really a factor of the federal tax credits that create this whole structure. And I'd be happy to talk more about that if that's of use. We select installers. We set the hiring requirements. All of our projects, we've used a 50% minority labor requirement. We manage subscriber engagement. We support various community organizations in reaching out to other members of the community. We operate these systems in the long term. And I wanted to highlight that while community solar is really a solution that is available right now, we see this as sort of the tip of the metaphorical iceberg in terms of how clean energy solutions can work going forward. This is a platform for then helping our members access financing without debt to insulate and air seal their homes, to participate in microgrids, to participate in community wind that forms partnership between rural or tribal communities and communities in the city. There's all of these future possibilities that as we create an immediate solution that is possible now, we're also building the member base, the political base, and the economic base to open up more of these models in the future so that communities really have control of their energy. I wanted to just highlight a few challenges and opportunities to get involved. Again, we're a community-based organization. We have dozens of people all across the state who are actively envisioning projects and pulling together the various pieces to make this happen and using the co-op as a channel to do so. One of these biggest challenges is finding good sites. Rural areas, it's somewhat easier. It's landowners who have 6 or 7 acres. This can be a huge benefit to family farms as an income source, and it's a relatively small use of land for a number of them. But as much as possible, we really want to be using this huge resource that we have in the city, which is, hundreds and hundreds of acres of roofs baking in the sun. And it has actually been really hard to get a lot of commercial property owners to see the opportunity, not just to see solar as something that helps them, but see their role as, as a public citizen, as a stakeholder in the community to create access for all. Despite the fact that, of course, you're providing an offer to them that it's a net positive for them as well. So that's been a big challenge and something that I think we're looking to help change the narrative on in terms of thinking about how large building owners think about their role in community. The utilities have put up a fight. They are increasingly realizing that clean energy is a threat to their monopoly because it allows so many other people to participate in the energy industry, and potentially erodes their ability to make money off of it. And so there's been a lot of state policy discussions, especially given, I think, the reasonable concern that so much of what community solar has been in Minnesota and elsewhere has really not focused on residents and communities. There's been a lot of discussion, and actually, originally, the compensation rate for subscribers was very high. And I think that's part of why you had this flood of out of state developers trying to serve larger subscribers. And that has changed, I think, in many ways to kind of slow that. Uh, uh, I guess you could call it land grab or industry grab. But it's changed also in a way that it's made it much harder to serve the residential communities and local communities that have the most to gain and most to benefit. There's a lot of current state policy discussion. This is actually even still ongoing, even during the coronavirus situation, but negotiation around how do we reorganize Minnesota's community solar program so that it is much more focused on residential access, on justice. And we're very excited to kind of see that energy democracy frame starting to take hold in the public policy conversation. We're also continuing to expand our base of community partnerships. So Elizabeth will talk in just a moment about some of the work that's happening in St. Paul, just as an example of that, but really looking for more and more collaborations with communities that want to envision and create their own clean energy solutions. That's really the vision here. I mean, energy has been so removed from our daily thinking in terms of, here's an opportunity to change how I live and work in a way that is going to make my life better, in a way that is going to advance justice in the community. It's not what you necessarily think of when you think of energy all the time. And so over time, we are looking to support more and more communities into stepping into that role, and are already in conversation with other groups all around the country that are trying to develop these sorts of projects as well. And then finally, I wanted to highlight that, as a co-op, we are also creating opportunities for community investment. We're participating in the divest, reinvest sector and movement, by creating ways for people in Minnesota as members of the co-op to directly invest capital in growing these types of solutions. And we also see that, not just as a benefit to the co-op, but it's also an important statement in terms of localizing the financing and bringing the returns even more back to communities, and starting to do investing and organizing capital in a way that really is a partnership between people with wealth and people who have been historically excluded from wealth, and seeing that investment as a way to build wealth for the whole community. I wanted to just briefly say in closing, I've been talking about a specific approach because I think it's a powerful example of how we make clean energy much more accessible and much more equitable. I do want to highlight, I see community solar as just like a beginning that is making this possible right now. And it's by no means the extent or the end of what energy democracy looks like. And I think you're seeing all over the country, fights against rate cases, against expensive, dirty power plant construction, for community choice over where energy is sourced, community ownership over those sources of clean energy, and people starting to think about energy as a relationship with land, a relationship with other communities, with each other. And that's really what energy democracy is about. It's about establishing collective control to energy in a format that is respectful of and responsive to both the human communities and the ecological communities that help make that energy possible, which of course is in direct contrast to the way our energy system largely works today, which is causing health impacts, destruction of communities, and economic collapse of many communities. Not even to add in the long-term prospects of what is happening with climate change. So I wanted to frame all of what I've been talking about in terms of that long-term journey and in terms of um, this growing movement. I mean, just in the past year, the number of communities and groups that are starting to talk about energy democracy, I'd say, has scaled up exponentially. And it's been really heartening as someone who's been in this space for roughly a decade to kind of feel it taking hold. And, amidst all of the conversations around economic justice and climate change, to really have people starting to think about, well, if we're going to make all of these transitions, we also need to have our communities, and particularly those of our communities that have faced the greatest negative impacts of our current system, have the power and the benefits from the transition. So I'm going to leave my information up there for a moment. Again, I want to thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth, and then we can go into Q&A.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you, Timothy, and take it away, Elizabeth.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thanks, Timothy, for presenting again. If there's one thing I think that this makes clear, it's that as we think about transitioning to a completely clean, renewable energy economy, one of the things that we must have as part of that is that we have a sense of ownership, both in our heads, our hearts, and in practical terms. And I do think that community solar, particularly a cooperative model, really gets to the heart of what ownership means. There are a lot of different ways to work on this issue. I know that Timothy can talk about specific legislation that has to do with the value of solar and how that's calculated and all of its effects in terms of how that promotes or doesn't promote more development of this industry. But I would say that at a local level, I've been very involved with St. Paul 350, which is an offshoot of Min 350. And one of the things that we find very powerful is this idea of place centered leadership. And what I mean by that is that people often feel very hopeless about what's going on at the national level because of the leadership or lack of leadership there. And sometimes people end up feeling equally hopeless at the state level, because if you don't have people in a majority who have a commitment to the ideals of clean energy and energy democracy, it's hard to get any kind of traction. But one of the ways that you can get traction at the local level is looking at your town or city and seeing if they have something like a climate action plan. If they don't have a climate action plan, and that means that if your local elected officials at the city council level don't have one, or the mayor doesn't have one, or if you have a manager instead of a mayor, if they don't have one, then it's time to get them on board and think about creating one. If you do have one at the local level, then it's time for to make sure that at a grassroots level you're involved in it. What is part of that? Are we talking about things like making sure the municipal buildings are completely energy efficient? Are we looking at making them solar ready or putting solar on them? Are we looking at solar on the schools if you're working with the school board? Um, how are you using zoning, or what are your development requirements if there's new development in the city and it's getting any kind of public funding? What are the requirements for making things energy efficient, new buildings energy efficient? What are the opportunities for upgrading old building? There are all kinds of things that you can use. There are policies out there. There are groups working on policies out there, um, where you can start to affect things at a local level. And frankly, some of the great joy of working in this area is working with people at the local level, your neighbors, your friends, and feeling like you can really get traction. One of the things that St. Paul 350 is going to be doing on Monday night, we have a very rare open seat in St. Paul in 67A, and we are sponsoring a candidate forum that is devoted to talking about energy democracy, and climate change. We're working with the candidates because we see this as an opportunity um, to educate the candidates, to educate the community, and to actually develop leadership in all the candidates who might be running for office, so that number one, they know something about it. Number two, they know the policies that they should be supporting. And number three, they realize that there are large groups of people out there who care about this. And then that makes the community into a partnership with the elected official, whoever it is, because we're not endorsing, we're just trying to educate. Um, so there are all kinds of ways that all of us can be working to promote the ideas of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and energy democracy. And I think I'll leave it there.
But one question we have here is, what does it mean to be a member of the cooperative, yours, the Energy Futures, Cooperative Energy Futures? Is there a project that a person can get their solar energy from? This person is asking from South Minneapolis, or is becoming a member of the co-op? What is involved? If like any one of us here today were interested in the work that you're doing, how could we participate?
Yeah. There's several roles. I would say, there's a very simple role of just becoming a member. Our membership, there's a place on our website where you can sign up online to be a member. We have a one-time $25 membership share purchase that essentially grants rights to be a voting member, to run for the board of directors. And then if you participate in a project, so if you participate in a community solar garden or some other business activity with the co-op, that membership is also what creates the entitlement to profit sharing as a part of that activity. But just like, a grocery co-op or any other kind of co-op, it's really based on the participation in a project or activity that kind of yields that economic role. You get a dividend from your co-op grocery store based on the proportion of the groceries that you are buying there as compared to another compared to another member. And the same thing here, except we're talking about energy. So our primary way of participating economically as a co-op member right now is through subscribing to a community solar garden. We do still do some on-site solar, like helping people put solar on their own homes, or also in-house like energy efficiency, so insulation, air sealing. But again, just from the various structural barriers in our society, that's a small proportion of our membership who's able to engage in that. We right now don't have a subscription opportunity right now in Minneapolis or St. Paul, because our projects here in the city have filled up. Other subscribers have used all of the capacity. However, we are right now also in conversation with a number of other sites and locations for new projects. And that's the other thing I wanted to highlight, that that last slide that I had brought up, showing kind of the ways to plug in. We're working very closely with Elizabeth and some of the other folks in St. Paul to identify new community solar gardens serving the St. Paul community. We have a number of conversations with sites in Minneapolis, in Bloomington, and various other communities around the Twin Cities. That will then open up opportunities for other community members to join in subscribing to those projects. And there are other ways to be involved, in supporting our public policy efforts or community investments efforts as well.
So just to clarify that, when you say participate in a project, buy a subscription, can I buy a subscription somewhere else, some other project you're working on, and then do I get benefit off of my utility bill, or is it just, how does that work?
So the current rules in Minnesota are that you can subscribe to any project. You have to be an Excel customer because, again, the state only requires Excel to do this. But as long as you're an Excel customer and you are in the same or adjacent county as the solar garden, then you can subscribe. So if you're in Ramsey County, you could subscribe to a project in Ramsey County, in Dakota County, in Hennepin County, so on and so forth. When you subscribe, effectively every month, you're going to see on your utility bill all the normal charges you get from Excel for paying for your energy. But then you're also going to see a credit, which is Excel paying you for the amount of energy that you generated from your portion of the solar garden. And we tend to size those subscriptions so that it's equivalent to your annual usage. So month to month, it'll vary because, in June, there's a lot more solar production than in December. But over the course of a year, that subscription will, in general, zero out your bill to Excel Energy. So most months, you'll have a $0 bill or a very low bill to Excel. And then about 90% of that savings, 90% of your reduced Excel bill, you pay to the co-op as your subscription fee, which allows the co-op to finance the garden and operate it. And over time, that discount, that 10% discount grows because we've designed it in a way that, we have to cover the upfront cost of building the system. But once that is covered and the system is being operated, any other profit we take in is just distributed back to members. So that there's sort of that back end benefit as well as the immediate bill savings.
Thank you. Another question here is, what is the main argument that big building owners have against putting solar power on their roofs?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we've run into is that it's a 25-year commitment, that effectively you're saying, you don't have to own this building for 25 years, but you're committing that any future owner of this building will maintain the space for the solar garden for 25 years, which effectively for many building owners, it reduces their theoretical options for redevelopment. Now, there are many areas inside the city where there's, large industrial corridors that I don't know how much redevelopment is really going to happen in them in the next 25 years, but there's always that possibility. And I think building owners looking to keep their redevelopment options open. And I think it's also just the second issue I just say is it's sort of a new model, and many building owners are used to thinking of, oh, solar, well, I'm going to have to pay hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for this. And so kind of the consideration that this could be actually a way to cut their operating costs and actually gain lease revenue isn't necessarily the first thing in people's minds. And we're actually really interested to see how the commercial building owner response to this changes in kind of the current economic environment as people are thinking about, how do we cut operating costs? How do we bring in new sources of revenue in maybe a more unsettled environment than people were in before? So we're curious to see if that plus kind of the public benefit lens of how do I create a broader benefit for my community, for my employees, for my customers, plays into how commercial building owners think about it.
Okay.
Someone has their hand raised.
Yeah.
Audrey.
Well, everyone should be typing in their questions in the chat. Another question is, can you share your kilowatt hour for solar versus fossil fuels? And this is multiple questions, and where the R&D has gone with that.
This is a very complicated question because it depends on whether you're talking about the production cost and over what scale of time versus the benefits that the utility is required to pay for it. So if you look at what's called the let me figure out how to best explain this. If you think about the lifetime cost of solar at a very large scale versus fossil fuels, we're basically at the point where solar is cheaper than coal. Solar is getting to the point where it is cost competitive with natural gas. Wind is already much cheaper than both. However, that changes based on, number one, the scale of development, meaning the larger the solar array you build, the lower the per watt cost, which is part of why community solar is much more advantageous than solar on your individual roof. We build at about half or even less the cost per unit as solar on your roof. The place that it gets challenging is the larger you build it, you also start to incur more costs of building new transmission lines, which is also a hidden cost that is never really talked about in the cost of fossil fuels, because they're almost always large centralized plants that require high voltage transmission lines. I'm seeing in the comment a note about data from 2009. I can say I know that since 2009, the cost of solar has come down about 60%. So the way that this industry is changing is that clean energy is getting more productive and cheaper all the time. Fossil fuels and other dirty energy systems are getting harder to access and more expensive over time. We're really at that crossing point with solar now. We had reached that crossing point on wind 10 years ago. Economically, the transition is here. Exactly how that works depends a lot on state policy, because the state policy determines how you calculate the value of different things, what the utility has a right to get reimbursed for, all of those other factors that determine the price.
Okay, we could go down that road some further ways, but I'm going to go to another question now. Just kind of a clarification on what you said about large building owners or commercial buildings don't want that 25-year. Does that apply for your own co-op members? And a person here is saying that they had talked to somebody about a solar garden, and to buy a membership, it was for 25 years. Mm-hmm. So for people who don't plan to be in their homes for that long, does it make sense to have a subscription?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here, and I do want to highlight that the contract terms are different for different developers. So I can tell you definitely what we do, and then also some of the things we've heard from other community solar developers. The first thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to stay in your home in order to keep using the subscription. You can take your subscription with you as long as the place that you move to is in the same or adjacent county and still served by Excel. So we have plenty of examples of subscribers changing their address and taking their subscription with them. The second thing is, obviously, that still is not going to serve everyone for 25 years. Maybe you're going to move out of state, or move to a place where you're not paying the utility bill or something like that. And that's really where it depends on the terms of the developer's contract. So because we're a member serving organization, we've really designed our subscription agreements so that it's very flexible, so that you can easily transfer to someone else, another family member, neighbor, somebody else that you identify. Or if you give the co-op 3 months notice, you can transfer back to the co-op with no penalty, which effectively just gives us time to find somebody else in the community who wants those same kilowatts. That is different with other developers. There are some developers that have a pretty high penalty or fee for transitioning or leaving early, or that kind of obligate you to continue paying until they find someone to take over your subscription, without necessarily clarity about how long that could be. So it really depends on the different developers. And I did want to highlight that a lot of the other developers in the state are not seeking to be long-term owners and operators. They develop these systems, set the contract terms, and then sell them to an investor. And we've seen a lot of examples of people not being able to get their questions answered from another developer and coming to us just to understand how this works.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Another question: can these projects function without the federal and state tax credits? The tax credits for solar for individual homes have dropped off.
Yeah, there has been a decline in the federal tax credits in general. It's last year it was 30%. This year it's 26%. It's going to drop next year 22%, and then barring federal policy change down to 10. It really depends on what happens with the rates, like the amount that the utility is required to pay subscribers. If that is returned to retail, which is what it originally was, I think these sorts of projects will be able to function even without those tax credits. And really, honestly, it's the structuring of those tax credits that sort of brings in and requires a lot of the investment capital that makes it harder to ensure some of the equity guidelines. So there is definitely concern with how the economics will work as the tax credits drop off, but that is potentially offset by some of the changes in the rules for how much utilities have to pay customers for their solar energy, as well as a variety of other factors just in the economics of the whole deal.
Timothy, can you just say something about the retail aspect of it? Because you just said something interesting that if the utilities were paying retail rates, there would be no need for the tax credits?
Yeah, so originally when this program was first started, and all of the 8 projects that we as a co-op have developed so far, and the vast majority of other community solar projects in the state so far, were developed when the utility was required to pay customers what was called applicable retail rate, which is basically the utility pays you roughly the same amount for the energy you produce as they charge you for the energy that you use. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's similar principle. And that rate structure, they actually had even incentives on top of that, but even just that basic number for a residential customer would be about 13.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you produce a kilowatt hour from a community solar garden, you'd get paid 13.5 cents. Now they have changed because of state law and various regulations to this really complicated calculation called the value of solar, which I'm not going to take the time to go into in depth, but basically is a really complex formula that we fight over at the Public Utilities Commission every single year that sets a formula for how that compensation rate changes over the 25-year life of a project. And right now, that value is about 9.5 cents, meaning Xcel is going to charge you 13.5 cents for the energy that you use and only pay you 9.5 cents for the energy that you generate. And that difference makes it much less cost effective to do these sorts of projects. And I think it actually raises major justice issues because, again, we currently have net metering for homeowners. So if you put solar on your own home, you're going to get compensated by the utility at 13.5 cents. That's what they're going to pay you for the energy you produce. But if you're a renter, or if you can't afford to put solar on your house, you're only getting paid 9.5 cents for the energy you produce.
So, in other words, whenever anybody asks about whether this could function without federal and state tax credits, people should know at the very beginning that the system is set up inequitably in favor of the utilities because they're not paying the same amount that they're making you pay.
Yeah, I mean, at least definitely that, the rules at the state level about who can participate and decide the price of how energy works are very significant and currently skewed towards the way the utilities have thought about how an energy system should run.
Just to that point, and then I have another point for Elizabeth, but just to follow up there, what about the argument that the utilities have to pay for the electrical infrastructure? So that's why they can have that differential.
Yeah, and this again gets very complicated because yes, there are grid services that the utility is providing to solar providers, like solar isn't producing in the middle of the night and the utility is still providing you with power, so that costs something. However, on the other hand, solar providers are also providing things to the grid that the utilities aren't paying for. For example, solar tends to produce energy on hot summer afternoons, which is a peak power time for the utility. And the utilities are often paying for energy from their suppliers at massively more than the retail cost. In some cases, during very high peak times, it's like 50 cents or even $1 per kilowatt hour to cover those peaks. And if they're not paying solar providers extra because solar providers are producing energy during that time, then they're undercompensating. And so there's a really complex kind of interchange here of what are solar providers providing to the grid that currently isn't getting compensated, and what are utilities providing to solar payers that may or may not be getting included in the factor right now. And a lot of times in the state policy discussions, all of those details aren't understood by either the policymakers or most of the public. And I think that's part of the challenge here, is like helping people understand that right now we are all locked in through our utility bills to paying for this big, expensive, complex system that has a lot of stranded costs in it, a lot of power plants that aren't being used anymore, a lot of transmission lines that may not be needed based on where we develop clean energy systems in the future, and we're still on the hook to pay for it. And so a lot of those costs, like, we need to have a much more nuanced conversation about which of those things we're paying for are actually needed in the energy system that we're trying to move towards. And should us as ratepayers, the people paying energy bills, be the only ones on the hook for paying for all of those bad investments? Because that's right now how we're treated. And that's very different from how investments in pretty much any other private industry works, where if the investors make a bad investment, there's investor loss.
What you should know is that the Public Utilities Commission, which is supposed to represent us, because we have a regulated utility industry here, the thing is that the Public Utilities Commission guarantees to these investor-owned utilities that they will get a certain amount of return on their investment, no matter what they invest in. So they could go out, for instance, or, Xcel has had a plan to create a new fracked gas plant in Minnesota. Well, we're all on the hook. They are guaranteed a rate of return from what we pay to them, no matter what they invest in. Now, the public and the Public Utilities Commission has said, well, we're not sure that fracked gas is a great investment right now, partly because A, we might not need it, and B, this fracked gas plant is going to be, once it's built, it could take, it'll take years to build, but then it will be in operation for decades. Well, should we really be investing in more gas at this point, especially fracked gas? So that's a question that's coming up. And that's one of the things that there's an opportunity for the public to say, hey, we don't want to be on the hook for this. We don't want to be paying for this for decades in the future. So, we have to look at ways around that. There's one way around that, which is to have a municipally owned energy. Now, there's all kinds of barriers to that, but there are places in Minnesota where the town actually owns the utility. Now, they don't always make the best decisions in terms of where they're getting their energy from, but the fact is that they have some control over it, and they can exercise that control without being dependent on Xcel or Centerpoint. So there are other options out there that need to be looked at. And, as Timothy said, it's a much deeper discussion. But people need to know about these and not just sort of assume that, not go all unconscious that when you flip a switch, well, the energy's there, so I don't think about it beyond that. There are opportunities. St. Paul and Minneapolis have franchise agreements with investor-owned utilities. In St. Paul, Xcel provides both gas and electric, but that is coming up for renewal in a few years. So there's an opportunity to think about, the franchise agreement is essentially saying we're making a commitment to Xcel. And in return for that commitment for 10 years, 20 years, whatever, we will get some money back from them. They will be charging all of us who live in St. Paul a fee that's the franchise fee. And that is a source of income for the city. But the fact is, we have a commitment now to Excel. So shouldn't we have some kind of say in where Excel is getting their energy? And can we put that into the franchise agreement about the type of energy we're receiving? So there are all kinds of places where we can exert influence. The Public Utilities Commission, through our franchise agreements, and we need to look at those.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was great because I wanted to speak about that. But we're running out of time. But I want a very practical question we have from one of our participants here, and that is exactly what are the streets around? What's that ward that there's an open seat? So if there's people in our audience this afternoon that might want to get involved in that or participate in that election and that whole discussion about educating those who are running for a seat.
That's terrific. Well, I'd be happy. I can give you my email address if anybody wants to contact me. But if they would like to watch the candidate forum on Zoom, they can go to the East Side Freedom Library, the Facebook page. It will be live streamed on Facebook. It will be live streamed on YouTube. Or you can go to the St. Paul 350 Facebook page, and there should be also a link there to watch it. It's 7 p.m. on Monday evening. But if anybody else wants to know about what kinds of questions we're asking, we've given the questions to the candidates in advance. We've sat down with candidates to educate them a little bit about this, and we've given them things to read, which I think is a great way to get candidates thinking about these things before they actually get in office and they're overwhelmed with having to know something about everything. We want to create climate champions before they're elected.
Yes, very good. Last question, and hopefully, yeah, we want to keep it short because we're over time. But just to that, our advocacy work, because we care a lot about that. Is it mostly, do you think, at the municipal level that we can do the most and at the public utilities? Or is there state legislation, and maybe Timothy has something to say this, that we should get involved in if we really want to democratize our energy? Are there policies at the state level, and is anyone championing those that would really help us change the structure of the way we produce and distribute energy here in Minnesota?
Yeah, Timothy should talk about the value of solar, and I can talk about other things.
Yeah, there is actually a major piece of policy that we have been working with Minnesota Solar Energy Industry Association, a number of legislators, a number of environmental advocacy groups, and actually talking with Excel too to talk about how do you reform the way that the community solar program works, as I mentioned, to more focus on communities and justice. The challenge is, and I found the state legislative process to be just fascinating in terms of how hard it is to actually get meaningful public uh, shaping of the process because of how quickly it moves. But right now, a lot of that conversation is kind of a negotiation that the legislators have asked the solar industry and Excel to do. And so there isn't like a very clear here's a way for public advocacy to make a difference. But yeah, there is major policy happening on the community solar front, even this session, despite coronavirus, that I think could really open things up for a more equitable approach to community solar. And then there's a lot more, Elizabeth, if you want to talk about kind of the broader picture.
Sure, there are a number of bills that are out there. There's the 100% campaign, which has its own organization that's working for. I believe that it's probably, this is my personal opinion now, it's a little bit inadequate because often they are saying that we need to get to 100% clean energy, but it's decades after we should be getting to it. Next year, Community Power is going to be introducing. It might introduce it this year, but the substantive work is going to happen next year. Something called the Clear Bill, which is trying to address things to make it easier for people to establish municipally owned power by taking out some of the barriers to that. Um, we're also working on things like inclusive financing, which is a way for everyone, but particular for lower income folks um, to get access, even if they're renters, to making their houses more energy efficient or investing in solar energy without credit checks and all of the typical barriers that happen to people when they want to when they want to upgrade their surroundings so they have a more comfortable living situation. um, you can go to the Community Power Minnesota website. Some of the stuff that we're working on is there. But again, I'm happy, I'd be happy to come back and talk in more detail. I can send you some information on the Clear Bill, which, again.
Okay. Well, I want to just give such a big thank you. We can't applaud um, Timothy and Elizabeth. This was really wonderful. I found it really gratifying. And being that it's April and it's Earth Month, or Earth Day is coming up. And this is such important work that both of you are doing. And I really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us today and to do this.